He was one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, wealthier than kings, feared in politics, and embedded deep within the core of Rome's ruling elite. But to his rivals, he was just the money guy. Marcus Licinius Crassus wasn't remembered for glorious battles or daring strategy. He was remembered for his bank account. While Julius Caesar carved out an empire in Gaul and Pompey crushed pirates and ruled the Mediterranean, Crassus sat in marble halls counting profits from real estate deals and slave auctions. His influence stretched across Rome, but his reputation lagged behind. In the eyes of many, he didn't fight for Rome. He bought it. Crassus wasn't blind to this. He knew the whispers, heard the jokes. They called him the third wheel of the triumvirate, the silent partner in a league of legends. And for a man whose pride was bigger than his empire of gold, that stung more than any sword ever could. At 60, Crassus could have retired into unimaginable luxury. He owned half of Rome, literally. His wealth built temples, bought loyalty, and kept senators in his pocket. But in a world where legacy was measured in blood and battlefield triumphs, gold just wasn't enough. That's when he made a choice, one that would echo through centuries. If he couldn't buy respect, he'd earn it with conquest. Not just any conquest, but one so bold, so ambitious, that even Caesar himself would be forced to look twice. East of Rome, past the Euphrates, lay Parthia, a glittering empire rich in silk, spices, and stories of unclaimed treasure. To Crassus, it wasn't just another province waiting to be conquered. It was the perfect target, a golden opportunity, in every sense of the word. But he didn't realize then, the same hunger that built his fortune was about to set the stage for his ruin. And what he chased next would bring him face to face with something gold couldn't save him from. It wasn't just pride that pushed Crassus toward Parthia. It was obsession. Stories flowed through Roman streets like wine at a feast. Endless caravans of gold and jewels, kings draped in silk, cities carved from desert stone. To most, they were legends. To Crassus, they sounded like inventory. He didn't just want to conquer Parthia, he wanted to own it, its trade routes, its riches, its glory. He saw it as the final piece of his legacy. Caesar had Gaul, Pompey had the East, Crassus would have Parthia. Then, finally, he'd be more than the empire's banker, he'd be a god of war. But there was one problem. The Roman Senate didn't trust him. They saw through his ambition. They knew this wasn't about Rome's glory. It was about Crassus's ego. And so, when he asked for a formal declaration of war, they refused. But Crassus didn't care. He wasn't asking for permission. He was already packing. In 55 BCE, he arrived in Syria as governor under the thin disguise of administrative duty. But everyone knew why he was really there. He immediately began raising one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever seen. 7 legions, nearly 40,000 men, plus thousands of cavalry and auxiliary units. This wasn't politics, this was war, and riding at his side was his son, Publius Crassus, young, charismatic, already proven in Caesar's campaigns. For Marcus, this wasn't just a military adventure, this was dynasty building. He was going to rewrite his family name in blood and gold, but the cracks were already starting to show. Local advisors warned him. Parthia wasn't like the provinces. Rome had steamrolled in the west. Their cavalry was deadly. Their tactics were alien. Their terrain unforgiving. But Crassus, swollen with pride, brushed it off. Rome was unstoppable. And he was rich. What could go wrong? Even when whispers reached him about political unrest in the Parthian court, an opportunity that seemed too perfect to ignore, he took it as a sign. The time was now. The gods were with him. What he didn't know was that those whispers, they were bait. And by the time he realized it, he was already marching straight into the trap. At first, everything went exactly the way Crassus had imagined. As his legions marched across the Euphrates, Parthian towns and villages surrendered without a fight. Others fell quickly to Roman siegecraft. His army, trained to perfection, moved like a machine across the flat Mesopotamian plain. It all seemed too easy, and that's because it was. Crassus mistook the calm for weakness. He believed Parthia was crumbling from within, that their forces were scattered, disorganized, ripe for the taking. Every mile confirmed his belief. Every minor victory fed his delusion. Rome had faced resistance before. This didn't even feel like a war. But far beyond the horizon, someone else was watching. Surena, the Parthian general, was young, but brilliant. He wasn't running from Rome. He was leading it, deeper into the desert, every surrendered town, every abandoned outpost, every day without contact. It was all part of a larger plan. Crassus thought he was invading Parthia. In reality, he was walking straight into Surena's design. The desert began to change. The days stretched hotter. The nights became restless. Roman scouts started reporting strange movements on distant ridges, just shadows, never close enough to engage. Supply lines began to stretch thin. Convoys were ambushed. The enemy was nowhere and everywhere. The terrain, which once seemed ideal for Roman formation tactics, began to betray them. Forced marches through endless sand drained the men of strength and morale. The legions were growing tired. But still, Crassus pressed forward. He couldn't retreat now, not with all of Rome watching, and Surena knew it. The Parthians didn't need to win a single battle. They only needed time. Time to weaken Rome's invincible armor. Time to let fear do the bleeding. The Romans expected warriors they could see, formations they could break, enemies who would fight face to face. Instead, they were stalked. And as the heat rose and the water ran low, a deadly realization began to settle in. They weren't hunting the enemy. The enemy was hunting them. It was June 9th, 53 BCE. The sun rose over the Mesopotamian plain, burning down on the assembled ranks of one of the most powerful armies Rome had ever sent east. Crassus had chosen to make his stand near a town called Carrhae. The terrain looked favorable. Open fields with nearby hills for defense and a water source to sustain the men. Intelligence suggested Surena's army was finally approaching. Crassus believed this would be the moment, his redemption, his glory. But what marched toward him wasn't like anything Rome had ever faced. There were no infantry lines, no siege engines, no formations familiar to the Roman eye. Instead, a sea of glinting horsemen spilled across the horizon, an army made entirely of cavalry. At the center, heavy cataphracts, warriors encased in metal from head to toe. Around them, swarms of Parthian horse archers, weaving and circling like a living storm. Then the sky went dark. Arrows rained down in waves, endless, unrelenting. Roman shields, built for close combat, proved useless against the sheer volume and velocity. The missiles never stopped. Parthian supply lines had been prepared with trains of camels carrying thousands of fresh arrows, ensuring the assault could last for hours. And it did. Crassus's soldiers endured it as long as they could, but their armor heated under the sun. Their mouths dried, their shields cracked. They were being slowly cooked alive and picked apart, not by hand-to-hand combat, but by a silent storm of precision attacks. Then came the critical mistake. Crassus's son, Publius, desperate to break the standoff and prove himself, led a cavalry charge against the Parthian center. It was bold, it was brave, it was exactly what Surena wanted. The heavy Parthian cavalry absorbed the charge. Then the horse archers enveloped the Roman cavalry from all sides, cutting them off entirely. Publius and his men were surrounded, trapped in a storm of arrows and spears. One by one, they fell. None made it back. Hours later, silence fell over the battlefield. Then, something emerged from the enemy lines. A spear. On top of it, Publius's severed head, held high for the Roman legions to see. Crassus watched in stunned silence. His soldiers saw it too, the son of their commander, brutalized and paraded like a trophy. In that moment, the facade shattered. Crassus, once so confident, stood frozen. The proud banker-turned-general was now just a father, broken, paralyzed by grief, and utterly lost. Roman discipline began to collapse. Officers couldn't issue commands. Troops looked for an escape. There was no victory coming, only death. And somewhere in the shifting sands beyond their reach, Surena watched. Knowing the real battle was already won. Crassus had come to Parthia seeking eternal glory. What he found was chaos. The moment Publius fell, so did the Roman illusion of control. Soldiers who had once marched in perfect formation now stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths dry, armor coated, in dust and despair. The death of Crassus' son wasn't just a personal loss. It was a psychological blow to the entire legion. If the commander's own blood couldn't survive this war, what chance did anyone else have? Surena didn't press the attack immediately. He didn't need to. The Romans were already breaking themselves. By nightfall, Crassus attempted the only move he had left: retreat. He ordered a withdrawal toward the nearby city of Carrhae, hoping that urban terrain might shield his exhausted men from the fast-moving Parthian cavalry. But this wasn't a tactical regrouping. It was a panic-fueled flight through unfamiliar desert. Men threw down their weapons just to move faster. Discipline vanished. Cohesion dissolved. Roman pride turned to blind survival. All around them, shadows moved. Parthian horsemen darted in and out, never staying long enough to be struck, but always there, like ghosts with arrows. Every skirmish bled more life from the legions. Every attempt at defense ended in more loss. The desert, once a path to conquest, had become a labyrinth of death. Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, was now leading a mob of survivors. Their numbers had been cut in half. Their standards, the sacred emblems of Roman identity, were lost in the dust. What remained was a broken column of bodies, fear, and failure. By the time they stumbled into Carrhae, they weren't an army anymore. They were refugees, beaten, dehydrated, grieving. But the worst part wasn't the loss of men. It was the silence from Crassus. The man who once spoke of destiny, empire, and eternal glory, who promised gold and honor, could barely give orders. His grief had hollowed him out. His dream of conquest had turned into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. And somewhere beyond the dunes, Surena was still watching, waiting. Because this war wasn't over. Not yet. Carrhae offered no salvation, just a temporary pause in the suffering. The city gave shelter from the desert winds, but not from the weight of failure pressing down on every Roman soul. Crassus sat in silence, his once grand ambition buried, beneath grief, humiliation, and the ashes of an army. Then, like a flicker of hope in the dark, an offer arrived. Surena sent envoys under a white flag. No arrows, no traps, just a message. Let's talk. A diplomatic meeting, commander to commander. A chance to negotiate safe passage for the surviving Roman forces. After all, Parthia had already made its point. Crassus seized it. His officers begged him to reconsider. Many smelled a trap. They reminded him of the broken codes, of Parthian cunning, of the battlefield deception that had already cost them everything. But Crassus couldn't afford to listen. Not anymore. He wasn't thinking like a general. He was thinking like a man desperate for an ending. Crassus agreed to the parley. The meeting was arranged on neutral ground between the two forces. Each side would bring only a handful of attendants. It was supposed to be formal, civil, even honorable. But honor had long since bled out into the sand. What happened next is still debated. Some say it was a setup from the start. Others blame miscommunication, fear, or mutual suspicion. But the result was the same. Violence exploded. In moments, Crassus and his delegation were surrounded and overpowered. The richest man in Rome, once untouchable, was now a prisoner of the very man who had outplayed him at every turn. And Sirena wasn't interested in a ransom. Crassus represented more than Rome. He symbolized arrogance, greed, and invasion without cause. His campaign hadn't been about justice or strategy. It had been about gold, about ego, about conquest for conquest's sake. And for that, Sirena had a punishment in mind, one that would echo louder than any victory. Because for a man who worshipped wealth, there could be no more fitting end. Marcus Crassus had spent his life chasing wealth, building it, hoarding it, worshipping it. Now, bound and broken in enemy hands, he was about to learn what that devotion truly meant. Sirena had no interest in a clean execution. This wasn't just about killing a general, it was about sending a message. Crassus hadn't merely invaded Parthian territory, he had done it out of greed, without provocation, with dreams not of honor, but of profit. And so the punishment had to match the crime. Before a crowd of Parthian nobles, soldiers, and the shattered remains of the Roman army, Crassus was brought to his knees. No trial, no last speech, just silence as his captors forced his mouth open. Then came the gold, molten, glowing, lethal, poured slowly down his throat. The heat alone could have killed him, but they didn't want speed. They wanted symbolism. Every drop of liquid gold seared flesh and bone, burning the very mouth that had once boasted of conquest, the throat that had spoken of destiny, the body that had chased glory across continents. This wasn't just an execution, it was a performance, a grotesque parody of his ambition, made horrifyingly literal. Crassus had spent decades accumulating wealth at the expense of others. Now, the very substance he worshipped was destroying him from the inside out. Witnesses described the moment as unforgettable, his body convulsing, smoke rising from his mouth, eyes wide with agony, and then stillness. The richest man in Rome died not with a sword in his hand, but with gold melting through his insides. Parthian audiences wouldn't forget. Roman prisoners wouldn't forget. And the world certainly didn't. The image of molten gold being forced down Crassus's throat became one of the most haunting symbols in ancient history, a warning carved in fire and metal. The message was clear. If you build your empire on greed, it may one day devour you. When news of Crassus's death reached Rome, it wasn't just shocking, it was unthinkable. This wasn't a minor defeat in a distant province. This was the collapse of a Roman army, the loss of 1/3 of the first triumvirate, the execution of the empire's wealthiest citizen in the most humiliating, symbolic fashion possible. The myth of Roman invincibility, carefully crafted over centuries, had been shattered in the sands of Mesopotamia, and the consequences rippled fast. The political alliance that had kept Rome from tearing itself apart, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, was over. Without Crassus's wealth and influence balancing the scales, Caesar and Pompey turned from partners to rivals. Within a few short years, the Republic would spiral into civil war, the very thing Crassus had hoped to avoid by launching his ill-fated campaign in the first place. In trying to solidify his legacy, Crassus had accidentally lit the fuse that would burn the Republic to the ground. But the shockwaves weren't limited to Rome. The Parthians used his death not just as a victory, but as psychological warfare. His severed head was reportedly sent to the court of King Orodes II, where it was used in theatrical plays, mocking Roman arrogance. Captured Roman soldiers were settled deep within the Parthian Empire, not executed, but assimilated. They lived as a quiet contrast to Crassus, survivors who submitted, instead of dying for one man's ambition. And what of the molten gold? Whether literal or embellished, the story endured. Ancient writers like Plutarch used it as a moral tale. The man who worshipped gold died by it. Historians still debate the details, but the meaning remains clear. Crassus's death became a parable, not just a military disaster, but a symbol of how unchecked greed, pride, and arrogance can destroy not just one man, but entire nations. Rome never truly recovered from Crassus-He. Future emperors approached the East with caution, aware now that not all enemies could be crushed by engineering and discipline. The Parthians were no longer seen as barbarians, but as equals. Strategic, sophisticated, deadly, and Crassus. He became a warning, a man who had everything but wanted more, a man who thought gold could buy greatness, and instead found that gold could burn hotter than glory ever shines. His molten death whispered a brutal truth through history. What we crave most fiercely can become the thing that destroys us.